The research on career change after 40 does not say what most people assume it says. In fact, on several of the metrics that actually matter: income recovery, role satisfaction, long-term employment stability, people who changed careers between their late 30s and early 50s outperform people who changed in their late 20s. Not slightly, meaningfully. And understanding why that is true will probably change the way you've been framing your own timing, because most of what you've absorbed about 40 being a cutoff, the intuition that the window is closing, or has already closed, didn't come from research. It came from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is exactly where this video starts. By the end of this, you'll have a specific, evidence-grounded picture of what career change actually looks like for people in their 40s, what the data says, what it doesn't say, and what it means for someone with your specific constraints. Not reassurance, evidence, that's a different thing. And it leads somewhere different. The idea that 40 is a career cutoff has a specific origin. It wasn't always there. It wasn't discovered through research. It was constructed, gradually, culturally, across decades, out of a particular model of how careers were supposed to work. That model came of age in the post-war American labor economy, a world built on long tenure employment, industrial loyalty contracts, and the idea that you picked a track in your 20s and followed it more or less to retirement. The implicit promise was stability in exchange for staying. You committed to the institution committed to you. In that world, leaving a career at 40 was genuinely disruptive. Not because you couldn't adapt, but because the structure you were leaving didn't have a re-entry mechanism. Once you stepped off the track kept moving without you. So stay, don't risk it, the window is closing was reasonable advice for that specific labor structure. The problem is that structure is largely gone. The average American now holds between 9 and 12 jobs across a working life. Mid-career movement isn't an aberration in the modern labor market. It is the market. But the cultural story didn't update at the same rate as the economy. The belief that 40 is a cutoff persisted, not because the data supported it, but because the story had been told to enough people for enough years that it began to feel like fact. And here's what that means for you specifically. The conclusion you may have been carrying, "It's probably too late for me," was never drawn from evidence about people in your situation. It was inherited from a labor market that no longer exists, for a career structure that no longer describes yours. So if that's where the belief came from, what does the actual research say? Let's go through it specifically. Because the numbers are not what the story prepared you for. Studies on career changers over 45 consistently find that roughly 80%, in some cohorts, higher, report success in their new roles. Not relief, not survival. Success by the metrics researchers used: role satisfaction, income parity or growth, long-term employment continuity. Income is where the picture gets particularly interesting. Voluntary career changers in the 45 to 54 bracket, people who chose to move rather than being forced to, have seen average wage growth above 7%. Compare that to the typical annual raise in a stable role, which has historically run somewhere between 2 and 4%. In other words, for people who move deliberately, the financial outcome isn't the casualty. For many, it's the gain. There's a long-term employment figure that tends to stop people when they hear it. Research tracking workers in their 60s found that those who had made a voluntary career change between 45 and 54 were more likely to still be employed than peers who stayed put. By a meaningful margin. That's not the data of people who took a reckless gamble. That's the data of people who made a calculated move, and whose working lives extended because of it. One more number worth sitting with. Career changers in their 40s show a 73% rate of achieving their core transition goals, compared to 54% for people who made career changes in their 20s. That gap is not accidental. And understanding why it exists is what changes the frame entirely. The question the data opens is this: why would someone changing careers at 42 outperform someone changing careers at 27 on average across multiple studies? If age were the liability the story implies it is, the answer should run the other way. But it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is the part that matters most for you. What the research identifies as the strongest predictors of career transition success are not demographic. They are not about your age, your field, or your title. They are behavioral and structural, and they describe something that accumulates over time. Specifically, the first predictor is network density with trusted relationships. Not contacts, but people who will actually vouch for you. Pass your name across a desk. Take the call from someone asking whether you're the real thing. This kind of network doesn't exist at 27. It is built across years of professional relationships that developed because you were competent, reliable, present. The second predictor is what researchers call skill overlap between fields. The degree to which what you've been doing in one domain maps onto what the new domain actually needs. Studies on this are striking. People who transitioned successfully after 45 showed an average skill overlap of around 50% with their new field. People who didn't showed an average overlap of around 14%. The implication: what you've spent years building is not wasted. It is transferable. What matters is knowing exactly what is transferable, which is something this video can point to, but that you have to do the work of actually seeing. Here is the reframe the data is pointing toward. Everything you've been counting against yourself, the years in the field that feels wrong, the competencies you built without enjoying them, the professional relationships you formed while quietly hollow. Those are exactly the inputs the research identifies as predictors of success. The years you spent building the wrong thing were not subtracted from your timeline. They were added to your leverage. The age cutoff story told you that time spent in the wrong career was a loss. The data says something more precise. Time spent building real skills, real networks, and real clarity about what fits you is a predictive asset, regardless of the industry where it was built. You've been misreading which direction time is working. The data gives you the general picture. What it can't give you is the specific inventory, the exact mapping of what you've built across 20 years of professional life onto what a new direction actually needs. That's the work of the Transferable Skills Audit in the description. It's a guided 45-minute process that produces a written document, not a list of soft skills, but a structured argument for what you specifically bring to a field you haven't worked in yet. If this video raised the question of what you're actually worth outside your current role, that's where the answer is. Now, the objection that is almost certainly here beneath all of this. Statistics describe populations, and you are not a population. You are a specific person with a mortgage, probably dependents, maybe a partner whose income is part of the same financial ecosystem, and a professional history that feels at this moment more like a constraint than an asset. That objection is legitimate. It deserves a direct response. Here's what the data actually means when you hold it next to real constraints. The predictors of success in mid-career transition are not about having optimal circumstances. They are about having the inputs and applying them deliberately. The people represented in those success statistics were not, in the majority, unencumbered. The research specifically on career changers over 40 skews toward people with financial obligations, because those are the people who are 40 who have been somewhere long enough to have built something. The constraint is already in the data. What separates the 80% from the 20% in the studies on mid-career transition success is not freedom from financial pressure. It is planning. Specifically, the data consistently shows that career changers who planned their transition months in advance, who did not leap but moved deliberately, succeeded at dramatically higher rates than those who didn't. 83% of self-reported successful career changers in one study described their transition as carefully planned. That is not a portrait of someone who had nothing to lose. That is a portrait of someone who took the transition seriously because they had real stakes. What the data is telling you, when you read it against your actual situation, the mortgage doesn't make the transition impossible. The mortgage is the reason you're going to plan it rather than gamble it. And planning it, the research suggests, is exactly what makes it work. If this opened the question of what you specifically bring to a new direction, the Transferable Skills Audit in the description is built exactly for that. It's the next step, and it's waiting in the link below. What was the specific belief about your timing that kept you in place the longest, and has anything in this video shifted it? You came to this video carrying a conclusion. Not a fear, exactly. A conclusion. One you'd probably arrived at quietly, somewhere between a birthday and a performance review, without anyone handing it to you explicitly. The conclusion that the window was closing, or had already closed. What the research says is something more specific than, it isn't too late. That framing is too thin for what the data actually shows. What the data shows is that people who changed careers in their 40s and early 50s, people who carried mortgages, dependents, financial obligations into a transition that felt like a gamble, succeeded at higher rates than people who made the same move younger. Not because they had more to work with in terms of freedom, because they had more to work with in terms of substance. 2 decades of professional credibility, networks built on actual relationship, not proximity. A clarity about fit that only comes from years of knowing what fit feels like when it's wrong. The years you spent in the wrong field were not wasted. They are the reason you have what the research identifies as the predictors of success. They are the reason the network exists. They are the reason you understand what you're building toward instead of guessing. The mechanism has a name now. The age cutoff belief was a cultural inheritance, one designed for a labor market that no longer exists, that got passed along long past its accuracy. And named things are navigable in a way that unnamed things are not. You are not someone for whom the window has closed. You are someone who has been looking at the wrong clock. The data says the timing is not working against you. It says the years were building something. And that something, the specific accumulation of it, the credibility and clarity and network and skill overlap, is exactly what a controlled exit is designed to use. Not someone else's version of this, yours.